It has been incredibly dry on the farm this year for us, and we've been scrambling over the last few weeks to mitigate this dry weather. I'm Rob from Drought Family Farms, and we pasture raise cattle and pigs, and we grow cover crops on some of our worst performing soils, partially to build soil health, but also to feed that livestock. In this video, I'll discuss the impact of the dry weather, its financial impact, and some of our strategies to mitigate what I expect to be an even drier summer. Now, let me start off by saying that the 20 to 25 inches of rain that my county has received so far this year is just behind our normal average. And in many areas of the country, they receive much less rainfall annually than we have so far this year. But it's important to remember that departures from the norm are important because soil types, climates, and many other factors play a huge impact. But it's also important to remember that things like stocking densities change depending on the climate and area and how much grass an area typically grows. And up until the last couple of weeks, our grass growth looked really good. We got enough rain, frequently enough, to get the cool season spring forages to perform pretty well. The clovers and fescue tend to be more shallowly rooted forages, and they'll perform well with frequent rain, even if it's less than the normal amount of rainfall. Now, in December of last year, we came off a really bad drought. Last July, we got 10 inches of rain in 12 days, and then on our farm, we received less than an inch of rain from August into the first part of December. So it was dry already. Usually in the winter and spring, we have enough rain to raise the water table in our soils. We have clay soils that typically don't absorb water very quickly. In fact, when it's dry, the water tends to run off the field rather than soak into the ground. But if we get enough rain, frequently enough, or long, slow rains, then the clay soil can hold a lot of water. Also, our farm hasn't received as much rain as our state has, or even in our county. My dad drove to another part of the state yesterday, 150 miles south and west, and he mentioned that it rained on him the whole trip. In fact, everything looked green in that part of the state. And further, even though our county has only about 3.5 inches short of its average year-to-date rainfall, our farm has received much, much less than the county average. The thunder showers that we get in warm weather are very sporadic. In fact, we live 2.5 miles as the crow flies from here. And I left the farm to get gas one afternoon. It was raining at our house, and they got 3/4 of an inch of rain. At the farm, when I got back, there wasn't even enough rain to settle the dust. Now, the impact of the dry weather has impacted our farm in several ways. First, we just came off the fall and winter season last year where we had to feed hay 3 times as long as we normally do. And further, when we start feeding hay, the cattle weren't in the best of condition to begin with. Body conditions suffered, and it made it harder for the cattle to perform well on the hay. And this takes a huge toll financially. But even though costs were higher and the cattle are bringing higher prices at the moment because of the droughts out west over the last couple of years, the financial impact is still huge. Second, the biggest impact of this dry weather in 2024 is that our cover crops are not performing nearly as well as they usually do. In January, I purchased a lightweight no-till drill. It works well in softer soils, but in hard, dry clays, it doesn't have enough weight to punch through that crust on top of the soil. On top of that, we planted more cover crops this year than we ever have before, over 35 acres of warm season cover crops. And frankly, they're underperforming as well. Now, in all fairness, there are other factors that influence the success of the cover crops this year. Part of it has been the timing of the planting and the termination of the previous crops. And I won't get into the details of that in this video, but there are some other factors that play a poor role in the germination rates we've seen. But if we had received our normal rainfall after planting those crops, we would have seen much, much better success. If I'd planted in April, I think it would have worked out okay, but I planted many of these fields in May, and we just didn't have the rain on the farm. Usually we have a lot of rain until the end of May and on into June. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. The dry weather has had the biggest impact on the forages for the pigs. For a year now, I've been experimenting with growing cover crops for our pigs to eat and to reduce the grain cost. And I've had a lot of great success for short periods of time. But many of those nutritious warm season forages are more shallowly rooted, especially things like buckwheat, and they're very susceptible to drought. So I haven't been able to graze our pigs on cover crops nearly as much recently. In fact, our larger pigs have been moved into shaded fields and forests because there's not much for the pigs to graze on. And of course, I'm having to make wallows and tote water prematurely because there's not enough moisture in the ground for the pigs to cool off in. Many of their normal wallows are dried up. Fourth, the dry weather is beginning to impact our grass growth. Fourth, now that the dry weather is beginning to impact our grass growth, it's impacting our grass-finished beef. Now, we grain finish a few cattle on pasture and grass finish some of our beef as well. But to finish the cattle on grass, I need really good, high-quality forages. It's hard to do this when those forages don't get any rain. And finally, for the main brood herd, it is looking pretty good at the moment. There are some cows that we need to cull out because they aren't performing well on the less nutritious forages. But for the most part, they are looking okay. But if this dry weather continues, we will have more stuff to deal with. And there are a few pasture paddocks that we aren't grazing right now because of the dry weather. For example, one paddock has a lot of Johnson grass in it. Johnson grass is a lot like the sorghum sudan grass behind me. It can become toxic in drought conditions. And honestly, I'm a little nervous about putting cows on it right now because it looks bone dry. So we aren't grazing that paddock. Now, there are several mitigation strategies that we've performed. First, and probably the most significant, is that the weather impacts cattle production more than anything else. So we've already destocked by 25%. Commodity cattle production runs pretty tight margins. We grow our brood herd on grass and they rarely receive any grain. Feeding costs like hay and grain are some of the highest inputs we have, and most of that hay we get locally is decent hay, but if the cattle are on it for more than a couple months, their body condition really begins to suffer. Then they need supplemental grain feeding, which is incredibly expensive. But by reducing our cattle numbers, we're saving forage that we can use as standing forage in the dry weather. Now, second, as you can see behind me, I've been irrigating some of our seasonal cover crops, but it's extremely difficult to irrigate more than 5 to 10 acres with my irrigation setup. But it is enough to provide forage for our grass-finished beef. And I can irrigate some of our pig paddocks and provide them with some good quality forage as well. That said, the irrigation has been a lot of work. Third, we can grow cover crops that are much more efficient with their water use. For example, the sorghum sudan grass, cowpeas, and forage soybeans are decent dry weather crops. They have deep tap roots and can provide subsoil moisture. They have different strengths and weaknesses, but they provide good forage and perform better than a lot of the perennial and annual forage crops that we can grow. And on some of our new ground we planted, different parts of the sorghum sudan grass have already grown anywhere from on 3/10 of an inch of rain to just under an inch of rainfall. But the sorghum sudan grass and the forage soybeans are regrowing, and apparently there is enough soil moisture for them right now because they're deeply rooted crops. I have other videos on each of these cover crops and I'm not going to address them here, but feel free to check those videos out if you want. Now, all of those are shorter strategies to mitigate the immediate needs that we have for this dry weather. But the next fourth and fifth things, I want to mention those long-term strategies that we're implementing. Now, we have a lot of fescue pasture, and it allows us to come out of winter a couple months earlier than many people in my area that have warm season forages, especially when it's mixed with other cool season crops like chicory, plantain, and clovers, of course. However, long-term, we need to develop more warm season pastures that provide good forage throughout the summer and on into the fall. If we don't get good fall moisture, then the fescue doesn't grow at all until December or January, and we don't get to graze it until March. Now, I'm developing this pasture south of Dowler Road with warm season forage. Right now, we're using annual cover crops because there's not much great summer forage. However, as the soil improves, as the deep-rooted warm season cover crops grow, it'll transition to a better perennial warm season pasture. Finally, the most significant strategy that we have is building soil organic matter. For each 1% of organic matter, about 12 inches deep, the soil can hold about an inch's worth of rain. But this inch of rainfall is moisture that's held in the ground. It's not running off or it's not evaporating because it's falling on hot days. Now, there are many other strategies to increase soil organic matter, but our cover crops are making a lot of progress in this area. Sorghum sudan grass, for example, can produce 6 to 12 tons or more of dry matter per acre. And whether the cows graze and poop most of it out, or whether it's trampled into the ground or even bush hogged, that is a huge boon for soil health. Further, the root action of sorghum sudan grass is really significant. More videos on that, of course. And this is a long-term strategy that will take a lot of time for it to be effective. And of course, rotationally grazing cattle and pigs, allowing the land to rest, maximizing grass growth, all play a huge role in soil health and building organic matter as well. Now, we may get a good hurricane come through and give us some rain. Right now, Hurricane Beryl is in the Gulf Coast, threatening Mexico and Texas as I'm recording this. Hopefully it'll come over and dump some rain on us, but that's a hope that we will get some rain, but it isn't an effective long-term strategy. By the way, say a prayer for those people that the storm is impacting. Even if it is a boon for us, it's still threatening a lot of people. So I'm kind of curious, where are you from? What has your weather been like? Have you had a wet or dry year so far? And what are you doing long-term to mitigate the impact of dry weather or even flooding? Let me know in the comments. Take care and have a great day.